Buenas tardes y bienvenidos a una nueva conversación de la Fundación Ramón Areces, que en esta ocasión lleva por título El Brexit hoy, la visión de los expertos sobre su desenlace económico y legal, y es una conversación que organizan de forma conjunta la Fundación Ramón Areces y Una Europa, que es una alianza de 8 universidades europeas. Mi nombre es Daniel Santín, yo soy profesor de Economía en la Universidad Complutense de Madrid y además colaboro con la Fundación Ramón Areces en la realización de parte de sus actividades del área de Ciencias Sociales. Bueno, la motivación de esta conversación es clara. Con el acuerdo del Brexit, el Reino Unido selló definitivamente su salida de la Unión Europea y se estableció una nueva relación comercial entre los dos bloques. Sin embargo, siguen existiendo distintas controversias alrededor de asuntos como, por ejemplo, el cumplimiento de los controles aduaneros entre la isla de Gran Bretaña e Irlanda del Norte, que para el Reino Unido crea fricciones en su mercado interior y pide mayor flexibilidad, mientras que para la Unión Europea no deja de ser un incumplimiento del acuerdo firmado. En resumen, preguntas como ¿qué sabemos hoy del funcionamiento de la relación acordada? ¿Qué aspectos siguen abiertos a negociación? ¿Está Reino Unido realmente incumpliendo los acuerdos previos? ¿Y qué está haciendo, puede o debe hacer la Unión Europea al respecto? Son preguntas abiertas y para responderlas y hablar acerca de este tópico tenemos hoy a 3 excelentes académicos. La profesora Swati Dhingra, que es profesora del Departamento de Economía de la London School of Economics e investigadora asociada del Center for Economic Performance de la misma universidad. Al profesor Jan Wouters, catedrático de Derecho Internacional y Organizaciones Internacionales de la KU de la Universidad de Lovaina, siendo además miembro del panel de arbitraje en el marco del Acuerdo de Retirada del Reino Unido y la Unión Europea. Y va a moderar el debate la profesora María Concepción Latorre, que es profesora titular de Universidad y vicedecana de Investigación, Posgrado y Relaciones Internacionales de la Facultad de Estudios Estadísticos de la Universidad Complutense de Madrid y además en la actualidad es miembro del grupo de expertos en comercio internacional de la Comisión Europea. La conversación va a ser en lengua inglesa. So let me change to English for a while, just to, on behalf of the director of this foundation, Mr. Raimundo Pérez Hernández Torra, to thank you for having accepted professors to be here today. We are sure that it's going to be really interesting to attend to this conference. So nothing else. Concha, you can proceed with the conversation, so the screen is yours.
Thank you. So, thank you very much, Professor Daniel Santín. I should first begin thanking Fundación Ramón Areces for sponsoring this promising seminar, which was proposed by the Una Europa Global Governance Research Group. And we really have heard a lot about Brexit, and it seems we're going to be hearing and reading for a long time about Brexit. But today, we have the chance to go into some deep questions about Brexit, for which much experience and a lot of perspective coming from international law and international economics is needed in order to reply to those complex questions about Brexit. So for that, we have 2 great experts, which I also want to thank you very much for joining us and sharing your time and your expertise about Brexit. And we're going to cover 2 broad topics, right? The legal aspects, what are the agreements ruling the relationship and what do they imply, what are the difficulties with them, and also the economic aspects of Brexit. So let me begin by briefly presenting our guest speakers and guest experts. You have their CVs on the website, Fundación Ramón Areces website, so I'll just be quick because you have, well, it was hard to summarize their CVs, but you have a lot of information, and I'll be quicker here just to point out some very important points in their CVs. So I'll begin with Professor Jan Wouters, who is a full professor of international law and international organizations in the Catholic University of Louvain. He's also a Jean Monnet Chair at Personam of the EU and Global Governance. He's a member of the Royal Academy of Belgium for Science. He has a lot of experience in consulting with important institutions, World Bank, United Nations, European Commission, Interpol. The list is long, OECD. I won't tell you all of them because it would be very long. And in recognition of his unique expertise in both EU and international law, he has been indicated as a member of the arbitration panel and the UK and EU Withdrawal Agreement since December 2020. So welcome, Professor Wouters. Let me also present Professor Swati Dhingra. She's an associate professor at the Department of Economics of the London School of Economics and also an associate researcher from the Center of Economic Performance from the LSE. She currently holds one of the most prestigious grants in research in Europe, and what we call an ERC, a European Research Council grant. She's a member of different panels. I'll mention some of them, very much related to our topic today. She's a member of the Modeling Review Expert Panel of the UK's Department of International Trade. She has long experience as a policy advisor with many institutions, European Commission, OECD, the Confederation of British Industry, Aids and Treasury, Parliamentary International Trade Committee, Scottish Parliament, National Assembly for Wales. Well, the list is long. And she has been interviewed by the Wall Street Journal, The Economist, the BBC, Bloomberg, Foreign Affairs, among others. So I really want to welcome you and thank you for your availability to be here today to discuss such an interesting topic, right? Brexit is very much on the news every day, right? And recently, we've seen this G7 summit with President Joe Biden discussing with Prime Minister Boris Johnson about the Northern Ireland Protocol and the issue with the sausage war, right? Which is, I think this gives the floor to Professor Jan Wouters to give us a bit like the background of why are we having such a clash between UK and the EU on this Northern Ireland Protocol. So Professor Wouters, please tell us.
Thank you very much, and it's a great honor to participate in this event. I'm grateful to the Fundación, and I would like to greet my LSE colleague as well. Well, let's start with the very beginning. The issue of Ireland and Northern Ireland has been laid down, has been regulated in a protocol on Ireland and Northern Ireland that is a part of the so-called Withdrawal Agreement between the European Union and the United Kingdom. For our audience, it is important to know that we basically currently have two international treaties that are in force between the United Kingdom, being out now of the European Union, and the European Union. The first one is this withdrawal agreement, and I will explain very briefly what it is about. The second one is a trade and cooperation agreement, which is a separate treaty between the UK and the European Union, concluded at the end of last year, and it basically only entered into force very, very recently on the 31st of, on the 1st of May 2021. Now, something about this withdrawal agreement, because this links immediately to the question of Northern Ireland. What is the withdrawal agreement about? You could basically say in layman's terms that it is a divorce arrangement. So it's basically the agreement between the United Kingdom and the European Union that wants to provide for an orderly withdrawal, an orderly kind of separation between the UK and the European Union. Let's remember that the UK has been in the European Union since 1973. So a very, very long period of many decades in which the UK was fully participated in the institutions, a period also in which you had free movement of persons and in which a lot of UK citizens went to the continent to work and live there, but also 5 million European Union citizens coming from the continent started to work in the United Kingdom. So the very first thing that needed to be arranged in that withdrawal agreement is the rights of citizens, the 5 million EU citizens currently still living in the UK, and the over 1 million UK nationals that are living in EU countries. Their rights had to be preserved. But then, of course, there were lots of issues about the winding down of the relationship, separation issues. Think about the status of goods that were already placed on the market before the end of the so-called transition period. When I say transition period, I have to point to a little complexity here. The withdrawal agreement was concluded in largely 2019, and it entered into force after the ratification of the two parties on the 31st of January 2020. Now, 31st of January 2020, I will always remember because I was in a workshop in London at Queen Mary University, and we were having a dinner after the workshop, and we were approaching 11 p.m. And that's when our host told us, now look, this is the moment in which the UK is formally leaving the European Union. And that's true. It was on a Friday evening, 11 p.m. Greenwich time. Of course, midnight continental, Central European time. But in fact, the UK left the European Union formally, but for the whole of 2020, until the 31st of December 2020, there was a transition period. And during that transition period, although the UK had formally already left the European Union, it was entirely participating in the single market, free movement of persons, goods, services, capital, and so on and so forth, as if it were still an EU member state. The big difference was that the UK in that transition period did not participate anymore in the decision-making in Brussels and in the European Parliament. So it was not represented anymore in the European institutions. But that transition period for the year of 2020 basically was a period in which, negotiations could take place on the future relationship. So the withdrawal agreement is basically about separation, financial settlement of all the obligations that the UK and the EU still had vis-a-vis each other. A number of special arrangements, including this very important Northern Ireland protocol, also a protocol on Gibraltar and on Cyprus besides. But so that's really meant to have an orderly separation. The future relationship had still to be negotiated and was indeed the object of very tense, difficult negotiations during 2020, a period of 8 months, which ended very, very shortly before Christmas, because indeed on the 24th of December, we will all remember Boris Johnson suddenly having his thumbs up and saying we have a deal that was so late in the year that the European Parliament was not able anymore to approve it on time before the end of 2020. So we did a very well-known legal trick. We gave provisional application to this UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement, and that basically meant we could start applying it from the 1st of January 2021 onwards, but it could only formally enter into force after the approval of the European Parliament and of course, the UK Parliament in the United Kingdom. So in that sense, we still needed the formal ratification process. And as I said, this happened, and in the end, the formal entry into force of this trade and cooperation agreement, the current trade relationship between the UK and the European Union, that formally entered into force on the 1st of May 2021. So just to say very clearly, the Northern Irish issue that has been so much mediatized now, and which is more or less becoming referred to in plain language as the sausage wars type of problem, is all about this protocol attached to the withdrawal agreement, and which gives a very special position to Northern Ireland with a view to preserving the dynamics of the Good Friday Agreement and thereby to avoid that, say, Ireland, the Irish island would be split. So in other words, Northern Ireland has a very special place. It is still a point of entry into the EU's customs union. And that basically means that there is this so-called hard customs border in the Irish Sea, and that indeed goods coming, such as those sausages coming from, say, Great Britain to Northern Ireland, now need to go through a number of, I would say, bureaucratic processes, because in a way it's a form of entry in the European Union single market, and there are all kinds of regulations that apply. That's not very much fun for the United Kingdom, but it was explicitly laid down and agreed as part of this protocol in the Withdrawal Agreement 2 years ago. And that's what the EU is now saying to the UK, pacta sunt servanda. You have to basically live up to the treaties that you signed. And that's a very well known principle in international law. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Wouters. Okay, let's move to the economic side of the story. We've seen there are several treaties ruling this relationship, withdrawal, the new trade and cooperation. And on the economic side, we have many studies that provide us with estimations about the economic impact of Brexit, but we see some discrepancies among those studies and a wide range of results. I wanted to ask Professor Dhingra, why so many discrepancies? What should we trust? What can we get from those economic impact estimations? Many of those were done by you, by the way, so thank you for providing us very good estimations. But tell us why some of these studies provide different results.
I'm going to really try to break that down in very, very simple terms, because actually the underlying logic behind these studies is very straightforward. And then all you do is put the data together to see what numbers they'll sort of, throw out. So the basic idea is that most of international trade would say that on the aggregate, we think that there'll be gains from trade. There can be some sectoral gains or losses, but largely you would expect that if two countries are trading with each other, they're choosing to trade with each other. And there must be some kind of, gains coming from the fact that I make something better than you, so I should devote my resources to that, while you should devote your resources to doing what you're better at doing. And that's broadly the idea behind why most economists think that there are gains from international trade. Now, of course, that in the case of the UK-EU relationship, you might argue that need not hold, because the EU is the supranational body at that point, which governs the UK's trade policy as well. So the key argument in the UK was that the EU is in fact hindering the UK from progressing further economically. And the reason for that is that there are a lot of regulations that are in place in the EU, which the UK has to adopt to be in the single market, and that's constraining economic activity in the UK. A second argument that was also given was that the UK has to comply with the EU's trade policy, because that was a competence that was given to the EU. And therefore, what the UK is doing is basically hurting itself by not being able to go out and sign deals with other nations that are possibly growing much faster than the European Union. So that was the broad argument that was given. And let me kind of explain to you a little bit as to what the studies did and why those studies have to be sort of thought of, and also thought of in the light of these two arguments as well. So the first point was that most of the studies would take standard international economics tools, and the idea behind it would be that we have a wealth of data on international trade transactions. Most countries collect customs data regularly, and in fact have been doing for centuries now. So it's one of the most sort of valuable resources to study international trade. If you look at trade data and you look at typically when countries get into trade agreements, what are the impacts on international trade and therefore on economic welfare, you typically tend to see that there are positive impacts of international trade on economic welfare when trade agreements take place. So that's the idea behind where those numbers are coming from. You take trade data, you try and estimate what is the impact of signing trade deals on trade. And then from there, you project to saying what has happened to economic welfare. You could think in terms of GDP of the country. You could think in terms of real wages of workers in the country, so on and so forth. So a lot of the studies that came out had to take a stand on one key thing, which is, one, what is the impact of trade agreements on international trade? And second of all, how would you think about what the increased costs from or in reduced benefits from leaving the European Union would be? So those are the 2 points of disagreement. There's no disagreement about trade data. We all sort of use the same data. So it's not really that's going to be an issue. There's also not much of a disagreement about the past impacts of trade agreements, though some people would differ on that. So then let's come to the question of, well, are those estimates sensible? And what are the costs or reduced benefits that would happen if you were to go in and out of the European Union? So overwhelmingly, economists have used various techniques, and I'm not just talking about the work that I've done, because that's much more the modern international economics view of it. But historically, there's been a lot of work by British historians like Nick Crafts, by really sort of senior economists like Rachel Griffiths, who's written tremendous amounts of work, who's done tremendous amounts of work on UK productivity, employment. And what those studies have typically shown us is that when the UK joined the European Union, there was an increase in economic activity in the UK, whether you look in terms of sort of real wages, whether you look in terms of employment, whether you look in terms of productivity. And that's really where sort of a lot of us would say that that's fairly compelling evidence saying that the EU has benefited the United Kingdom in economy. The disagreement comes from the fact what will happen in the future. And that's where a lot of the work that was done by, so let me first say that 96% of economists agree that leaving the European Union will hurt the UK economy. There's a very small percentage that in fact disagrees. The reason for disagreement is one, that the EU regulations are actually reducing productivity in the UK. As I've mentioned, these historical studies don't find that. If you look at future projections of how much you can save by getting out of EU regulatory framework, most of these people are basically referring to the sustainability impact assessments, tools like these, which are done regularly by governments when they get into trade agreements. And their point would be that if you look at the impact assessments, the UK has lost out on about 0.9% of GDP every year by having to comply with these regulations, which reduce economic activity for UK businesses. Now, if you dig a little bit deeper into that number, where that number is really coming from is primarily almost sort of 50% of what they calculate to be the costs of being in the EU are coming from complying with the working time directives and complying with the EU's renewable energy climate change strategies. So these are not what a typical economist, the consensus view in economics would not be that these are necessarily costs alone. These are also providing benefits to workers at home, providing benefits for future generations. So simply counting them as costs is wrong to begin with. And that's really sort of the bulk of where those numbers are coming from. The second part where those numbers are coming from is that what are the increased trade costs that we expect after leaving the European Union? From the point of view of most consensus, the consensus view in economics would be that we can look at what past episodes have done in terms of saving, in terms of how much trade costs are saved by being part of an agreement. We can use those kinds of numbers, or we can come up with sort of sensible numbers about that we think, maybe in the sort of really before the agreement actually took place. Well, if you go under WTO rules, then the MFN tariffs will kick in, the ones that apply to all third countries of the EU. But if you have a really sort of soft Brexit, which to some degree in trade and goods we do have now, then that'd be zero tariffs. So those are the kinds of judgment calls you make, somewhere between zero tariffs and somewhere between MFN tariffs. But where these numbers are coming from, which the sort of the very minority view of in economics is that they would say, well, look at the price differences between, for example, how much is a sausage in Northern Ireland, how much is a sausage in the EU, how much is a sausage in the UK. And that difference, the price difference, is telling you that in the world, if I had bought sausage, I would have paid, say, 80p. And in the UK, I'm paying £1, and that 20p is what is coming from EU regulations. It's a fairly sort of heroic assumption. And it turns out that, in fact, of course, price differences are not driven purely by tariffs and not driven purely by trade costs. They also have within them quality. So if you're paying more for a German toy as opposed to a Chinese toy, you probably have an expectation that the German toy is not going to be contaminated, while while there is a higher probability that the Chinese toy would be. So in that sense, simply taking these price differences and then giving the view that, that's the kind of reduction in trade costs that would arise if we leave the European Union and start buying sausages on our own terms or toys on our own terms, I think is really erroneous. And most of us sort of agree that, in fact, the consensus view now that's emerging is that leaving the European Union will have long-term negative impacts on the UK economy, largely because of the loss in market access that's happening, both for trade in goods as well as for trade in services. So I'll stop there unless there's specific questions, and I can come back and explain those more clearly.
Okay, no, that sounds very interesting, Professor Dhingra. Thank you very much. Let me turn now again to the legal issues and ask Professor Wouters, with this agreement in the background, ruling this new relationship, you know the details, Professor Wouters. Could we say that in these agreements there are winners or losers? Has the UK, come out badly from this regulation? Can you give us a bit of an insight regarding those questions?
Your question mainly related to the trade and cooperation agreement?
Whatever you like. I think we have both, whatever you want to highlight.
It's hard to talk in terms of winners and losers because, as you know, a treaty that is signed and ratified by the two parties presupposes that something of a compromise has been struck. And indeed, it took long negotiations. I would also recall that with regard to the withdrawal agreement, in fact, a first version of that agreement had been agreed under Prime Minister Theresa May, but it had been rejected by the UK Parliament, and then Theresa May resigned and Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, and there were all kinds of renegotiations going on, especially with regard to the so-called question whether the UK, in terms of say the back channel or backlog, would remain in the customs union or not. In the end, the amended agreement did not differ that much from the one agreed under Theresa May. But yes, there was, instead of the backstop, there was now the Irish Northern Ireland Protocol, and which indeed now chases us a little bit because it has produced some consequences, which we could anticipate, but which politically, I guess, were a little bit downplayed at the time of the conclusion of the agreement. So it's a compromise, and also the UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement is a compromise. What I found very interesting was, say, the different level of ambitions of the two partners. The European Commission, when it made the draft proposed agreement for the future trade relationship, I think was far more ambitious and really saw it as a real partnership agreement. And the word partnership disappeared. So that's why there is the more neutral cooperation, because indeed, if you look at the agreement, first of all, it's a very special trade agreement because in history, I've been told it's one of the very first free trade agreements between two players that actually reduces free trade rather than increase free trade, as you see where we're coming from in the EU-UK relationship. So that's already very special. Another special thing I must say is the fact that it mainly has to do with, as my LSE colleague has said, trading goods. So it's really a free trade agreement that provides for no tariffs and no quotas on bilateral trading goods between the UK and the EU. But for instance, with regard to services, and especially financial services, you would have maybe expected that there would be a kind of urge in the United Kingdom to preserve let's say, the status of the City of London, of the big, say, financial market interests of London. And in fact, it's not regulated, it's not negotiated, it's not a part of the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement. So probably I would say this will be further negotiated in the future. To be very honest, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement lasts in an initial period of 5 years, but it will be probably constantly reviewed and renegotiated also with regard to specific areas. You know, also in that Trade and Cooperation Agreement, we had a very difficult negotiation about fisheries, remember? which really went very far and even at the breaking point. But the final compromise is still that, yes, there is a cut of 25% in, say, the value of fish that EU fishermen may catch in UK waters. And then you have this long transition period of 5.5 years in which this will gradually also decline. And so, I mean, in every sector, like fisheries, but also road transport, data transfers, aviation, energy, and so on, there are all kinds of things that, on the one hand are touched upon in the agreement, on the other hand, will still need to be further elaborated. For instance, with regard to product standards, there is, as of yet, no real agreement on mutual recognition of conformity assessment. So in other words, the paperwork has increased dramatically. I mean, that's part of course, the cost of Brexit is that, as we have seen also in the beginning of this year, long lines, trucks that have to stand in line because they were not all fully in order with the additional paperwork and so on. So, I mean, yes, I would not dare to say who is the winner, who is the loser. We just heard the news after last weekend that the UK has now struck an important free trade agreement with Australia, and that apparently this new free trade agreement is the first one in which it's really, say, the UK negotiating its own type of, model of free trade agreement, whereas some of the other free trade deals struck by the United Kingdom after Brexit have been largely a continuation along the EU existing agreements with the third country in question. Apparently, this is a new thing. Would be interesting to look also what it represents. I've already noticed that there is some unrest, especially with UK farmers, with regard to, again, sausages and all kinds of meat coming from Australia that may not reflect the proper UK standards. So, I mean, in that sense, I'm very much intrigued by what the vision of global Britain will entail, especially for, let's say, the population in the United Kingdom and specific sectors, especially the farmers and fishermen in the United Kingdom. I'm going to stop here, if I may.
Thank you, Professor Wouters. So, Professor Dhingra, going deeper into the impact, Brexit is here, right? It's already happening, and we have not much information yet, but could you tell us a bit how you see the current impact? And also, I think an important question here is how can we be sure we can separate a COVID impact from Brexit, and how to deal with all that?
So that's probably the hardest question to answer. I'll give you a historical view of it, in the sense that when in the run-up to the referendum, a lot of the work that produced estimates of what the long-term economic hit to the UK economy would be were very much along the lines of what I just said. We take trade data, we understand what the impacts of trade agreements are, and then we put those two things together and give a welfare assessment. That's very much sort of still, those numbers are not going to change in terms of the projections for the long-term economic hit. And the reason those numbers are not going to change is because what you need to do those numbers is what the initial trade was with the EU, because you don't want to use something which has happened after the change, after the Brexit vote, because that's already then contaminated with responses that might happen by governments. So that number hasn't changed. The historical responses to trade agreements haven't changed. The only way you can really update those numbers is saying that, okay, we're not going to be thinking between a really soft and a really hard deal anymore. We know what the specifics of the deal look like. So that lets you then, put it somewhere in the middle of those two estimates. Now, what else has happened, which is that we have the 4-year period after which 2016 onwards, when the Brexit referendum had happened, but the Brexit actual exit had still not taken place. So we have 4 years of data from there. We also have now what is newly available data coming in after the Brexit event has actually occurred. So let me start with saying why I thought this was a really hard question to answer, and then I can tell you something more concretely about stuff that we do understand. So the really hard part of it is saying, since Brexit has happened, since Jan 2021, in this case, what has been the impact on the UK economy? It's a really hard question to answer because, yes, I mean, exactly as you pointed out, there are the COVID impacts which are embedded in all of these numbers. And I will say that I think some of the numbers are very telling. So trade has fallen by 1/4 with the EU. It hasn't fallen so much with the rest of the world. In fact, very, very small numbers, single-digit numbers as to how much it's fallen with the rest of the world. If you look at, if you go beyond trade and you start looking at some kind of real-time data, which we've done by basically talking to both the Bank of England in terms of what their decision makers panel is, where they go and they interview firms quickly afterwards, that gives us some clues. And then the Confederation of British Industry conducts these sort of monthly and quarterly surveys of their members as well as non-members. And they've been doing so for the past sort of, 10, 15 years, so that we have some sense of how good that data is. And from all of those various pieces of evidence, what emerges is that a lot of businesses are pointing out that they have experienced delays at borders, they've experienced additional custom checks, they've also experienced issues in shipping goods from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. A lot of this information, though, is very much biased towards trade and goods and towards manufacturing industries or agricultural industries. And we've got to remember that's less than 20% of UK employment. So when it comes to the really big deal, exactly as Professor Wouters pointed out, that the agreement is about trade and goods, not so much about trade and services. And a lot of what is to come in the future is going to be dictated by what happens, how the trade and services unfold as well. And there's going to be negotiation, renegotiation, waiting for equivalence, all of these other objects. So just simply looking at the data, it's indicative that there seems to be something more going on in terms of, we see this very sharp peak in the CBI data in terms of what businesses are saying about how much their EU competitiveness has fallen. And these are the same firms that are not at the same time saying that their non-EU competitiveness has fallen. So that's quite striking. In terms of sort of the trade numbers going down, that's quite striking that they're going down with the EU versus non-EU. But take everything I'm saying with a grain of salt. There's been such a profound economic impact from COVID that it's very hard for us to distinguish between what is the COVID effect, what is a short-term disruption of Brexit, and what is actually a long-term reorientation of economic ties. And we're not going to know that very soon. So I'm very cautious of saying anything with the current numbers. And I think everybody should have that sense of caution attached to it when they see those numbers. There's a second component of it, which is we have had 4 years of the referendum when we knew, the ups and downs of, are we going to be in a hard Brexit? Are we going to be in a soft Brexit? And the really, really big event that happened on the night of the Brexit referendum, which is that the pound saw its biggest ever depreciation. In fact, it's not just pound's biggest ever depreciation. This is the biggest depreciation that's ever happened within an overnight in any of the 4 major currencies of the world. So we're talking about something which already manifested itself, which is not in any of our calculations because we're typically focused on trade and the real economy. And we're not taking into account all of these other factors which also affect the macroeconomy. And what we've seen from that already is that prices really went up, consumer prices, wages, nominal wages as to what workers get paid, didn't really sort of, you would have thought that maybe they're going to react as well and rise. No, in fact, they fell, and they fell particularly in sectors which are really entrenched in global value chains. And that's what you end up seeing, that even though one would have thought that, what Brexit is going to do is going to bring prosperity to workers in the UK, that really wasn't what it did. It had a one-off negative real wage impact on workers in the UK. So I think many of these pieces are coming together, and what we're seeing is a lot of what most of us sort of expected would happen based on, sort of standard economic principles, that yes, if trade costs rise, trade falls, and that ends up hurting economic activity at home. So I think those are some of the things that are coming together, but I think making a very big deal of the new numbers that are coming out, I would really advise a lot of caution on that.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Dhingra. Professor Wouters, you are an expert in dispute settlement mechanisms. Is really the UK in compliance now? What is going to happen now with this Northern Ireland protocol, and what can be done from the EU side and from the UK side based on your experience in these dispute settlement mechanisms?
Under the protocol, you have on the one hand a very, I would say, supranational system of dispute settlement because it confers full jurisdiction to the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg. And that may be surprising and even shocking to some people, because indeed many proponents of Brexit wanted to have the UK leave the European Union in order to escape the case law and the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. But so, especially on those provisions under that protocol, which have to do with preserving the integrity of the single market, free movement of goods, technical regulations, state aid, questions of VAT and excise, and so on, the European Commission still has the power to basically bring the United Kingdom before the European Court of Justice. And all the other proceedings before the Court of Justice also apply, including the possibility of so-called preliminary references, questions from national courts to the European Court of Justice. So that's quite remarkable. Those provisions of the protocol that have to do with, say, single market aspects, free trade in goods and so on, can be brought before the European Court of Justice. And this is not theory. The European Commission has already twice threatened to start suing the United Kingdom before the Court of Justice. The first time happened in October 2020, when you will remember that the British government was having its internal market bill, and that as part of that internal market bill, there was the idea of, say, the UK law itself defining what state aid is, and what state aid should be or should not be reported to the EU, and also basically defining unilaterally what it considers products that are at risk of being brought into Ireland from Northern Ireland. This was something where the Commission immediately said, this is a violation of the protocol, it's a violation of your international law obligations. And so there it sent a formal letter, a formal notice to the British government. And it ended up with a compromise in the sense that in December, there was a meeting of the so-called joint committee. What is a joint committee? The joint committee is the main body that has been created to bring the UK and EU representatives together to discuss all kinds of issues about the life and the implementation of the withdrawal agreement. So there you have indeed UK delegates and EU delegates, European Commission delegates meeting each other. And in December, they reached an agreement in principle, and the UK agreed to withdraw the problematic clauses from the internal market bill. But now there is a new dispute on the block, and that is indeed because the United Kingdom in the spring of this year, 2021, has basically extended unilaterally a number of grace periods for so-called post-Brexit checks on particular goods entering from Northern Ireland, from Great Britain, including the famous sausages. And so there also the European Commission has indicated that this is really a violation of the, say, responsibilities under the protocol, and has indeed announced that it is initiating infringement proceedings. So for that part of the protocol, you may have cases landing before the European Court of Justice, and the UK has accepted the jurisdiction of the court. But then there are other provisions of this protocol which are not within the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, and that's where the arbitration mechanism sets in. And arbitration is a very, very different system from the one I just described, the European Court of Justice, which is a supranational court with lots of powers and procedural, specialties. Arbitration is a very traditional way of dispute settlement in international law, which basically involves that the two parties designate arbitrators, members of an arbitration panel, and then they agree on trying to solve the issue through that arbitration panel. So, I mean, there are certain issues which for sure may end up before the arbitration panel and not the European Court of Justice, but even here, there is a big surprise in the protocol, because if the arbitration panel is established and if it finds out that in order to rule on the dispute, they have to touch and they have to interpret certain provisions of European Union law, then there is a duty of the panel to refer preliminary questions to the European Court of Justice. So the European Court of Justice, even in arbitration panel proceedings, makes something of a surprise comeback when issues of EU law need to be tackled and interpreted. And the Court of Justice will then give a ruling which will be binding upon the arbitration panel. So you see, the Court of Justice is coming again back through the back door here, which is quite remarkable, because indeed it shows you how, yes, indeed, in the negotiations, this was a very important point for the European Union. So you see, it's a very complex setup for settling disputes under the Irish Northern Ireland Protocol. Under the new Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the system is a little bit more simple in the sense that, yes, this is the future relationship. And there, of course, you can imagine that the United Kingdom did not want to accept the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice anymore. And so there you really have arbitration as the dispute settlement system without a special role for the European Court of Justice. I hope this is a little bit clear, because there's still many details and nuances that makes the system even a bit more complicated than what I have been telling you. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. For people like me that are an economist, that provides a great overview about this complicated system that in the end is a bit more in the hands of Europe, it seems to me, Professor Wouters, but anyway. So, Professor Dhingra, much of the logic, of the economic logic, because I think you've been telling us that according to economic logic, maybe Brexit was not a good idea, right? But what Brexiteers were saying is, oh, the future is in Asia, right? Lies in Asia. The growth is there. So can we think, because UK has already knocked on the door of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, for example, right? So can you tell us a bit how you see the possibility of doing these other agreements? We've just mentioned also the Australia agreement. So beyond Europe and even within Europe, they have already signed an agreement with Norway and Iceland. That's smaller, but maybe can you tell us a bit more about the logic of doing more business beyond Europe, how you see that?
Sure. So one of the key arguments of most people who supported Brexit was that the UK will be able to go do its global Britain strategy, which is go sign all of these various trade agreements with other countries, many of them, as you mentioned, potentially much higher growth economies than the European Union. I find that actually the most compelling argument in favor of Brexit economically. Why I think it fails is because of the reality of how trade agreements work. So let me give you one or two examples which will help sort of solidify this. So let's start with the examples of China and India. India is very much on the cards already in terms of having a UK-India partnership for obvious reasons, of course, huge colonial historical ties, and people like me exist in this country for that reason. So, but putting all of that aside, the key point is that if you in fact look at how much the UK currently trades with, say, China or with India, with China, the share of UK trade is about 7%. With India, it's about 2%. In terms of FDI, the numbers are under 1% or just about 1% of FDI. So we're talking about fairly small trade shares, small investment shares of countries like, even the really big countries like China and India with the UK. If you compare that with how much the European Union and UK trade is, we're talking in the order of upwards of 40%, depending on which indicator you're looking at, exports, imports, FDI. So just to get to that level, I mean, if you want to say something like, well, we'll get out of the EU, we'll lose some growth there, but we'll make up for it in growth with these other new emerging economies. That's just going to be a very, very challenging thing to do. Most trade agreements don't increase trade or investment to that degree. that you would, almost need to like triple or 4 times the amount that you have with the European Union. If you're thinking of FDI, you're basically talking, I want 40 times more investment coming from these sorts of countries. So I feel like that's a really sort of simple levels issue, which is that you're just not trading enough with China and India. They're far away. They have a somewhat different economic structure. And saying that we're going to replace EU trade with those countries is really sort of erroneous. Then there's a second component of it, which is, well, these are also economies with which it's going to be much harder for the UK to negotiate with on both grounds. One is that simply that they're much, these are big economies, China, India, the US, and they're going to have a lot of bargaining power in those negotiations, which the UK alone will have much less of. But if it went with the European Union and future trade agreements, of course, the bargaining power of the EU vis-a-vis these big countries is going to be much more commensurate. There's that element. And then there's the second element, which is what is the content of what you want to negotiate with? And I think this is really what's getting lost in the debate currently in the UK, that we're on this very firm, very, very sort of, we're jubilant about the fact that we're signing all of these new trade agreements. But the question is, what is the content of those negotiations? Which winners and which losers is it going to create? And ultimately, is it getting to the economic goal of the Conservative Party in its manifesto, which was to provide a levelling up agenda for the UK economy, to ensure that people from all over the UK are able to participate in shared prosperity. That's much harder to justify when you're thinking of countries like China and India. And in fact, already with the UK-India agreement, there's some level of sort of, the negotiation, the text that's being floated around. It seems like intra-company transfers, which is, movement of workers across borders, which has been a really big sticking point for UK in the past in the EU-India negotiations, that's starting to sort of emerge its head again. So the question is really that how much does the UK gain from these agreements? How easy is it to negotiate with these countries? We've already seen in the China-Switzerland case that Switzerland got much less out of it than China got out of Switzerland. Again, that's a fairly good comparison to have in mind because the UK is sort of similarly placed as Switzerland would be vis-a-vis China. Then let me end with sort of one final point on that, which is, I think, a little bit where the Brexiteer instincts come from, that they want to go out of the EU sphere and into much more the US sphere. And that's something which we're starting to see unfold. Yes, the US is a really big trade partner for the UK, but it's not still quite as big as the European Union. And it is in particular types of goods and sectors and services which necessarily aren't going to give you the levelling up agenda that, that the Conservative Party promised, mainly because a lot of the UK-US trade is really going to be about sectors like financial services, which aren't going to lift all people with them. They're going to be very much for specific skill groups, and which is why it becomes even more pertinent that if we're willing to sacrifice, which now we understand is not happening, but things like working time directives, but we're willing to go sign deals with the US, which are much more about deregulating the financial services sector, then I think it really brings back this huge question of, well, what are these negotiations, these future trade agreements going to accomplish, and who are they really going to benefit? Are we just perpetuating the same sort of economic structure that we've been expressing, sort of some level of dissent with, or are we going to sort of usher in a new era? And I worry that it's much more going in the direction of creating a more deregulated economy, which will benefit certain sets of people and not provide wide benefits.
Thank you very much. So we are unfortunately running out of time. I'll just pose 2 more questions, or also leave the floor open if you just want to finish with maybe any idea that you think it's relevant and hasn't come out because of lack of time or any other reason. I will ask Professor Wouters, but I leave it open, as I say, for him to finalize as he wishes. For me, it was a sort of concern whether UK may run into a race to the bottom because now it's free in some regards not to follow the EU regulation. That would be one question. I'll put the other one for Professor Dhingra, and we'll have to cut shortly. But just to ask you, you may finish as you wish, Professor Dhingra, but what would have been your preferred Brexit agreement, probably not a Brexit you would have preferred, right? I guess, but how would you have built that agreement if you were to, as you do, to give advice to policymakers? So those are the two questions, but as I say, I leave it up to you to finish as you wish.
You want me to go first?
Yeah, please, Professor Wouters.
Okay, well, it's a difficult question because, as I said, especially the trade and cooperation agreement is not yet a comprehensive agreement. And so it's mainly dealing with trading goods, and even there, you don't have every form of further agreement with regard to conformity assessment, all kinds of technical regulations, standards, certification procedures, and so on. But yes, and then look at services where there is very, very little, and where in fact most still needs to be negotiated for such an important part of the UK economy. And there's still many, many other loose ends. So this will require almost perpetual negotiations between the UK and the EU. So for the next coming years, expect not just many hiccups and tensions, because indeed some things are simply, well, have been signed up to in the agreement. Think of the Irish Protocol, but are now given different interpretations, or are now only fully becoming politically clear in terms of their impact upon the situation in Northern Ireland, for instance. So, I mean, yes, there are loose ends, and there are certain things that are absolutely not yet agreed upon. And we are seeing also that the bodies that have been created, and the joint committee under the Withdrawal Agreement, the Partnership Council, under the new Trade and Cooperation Agreement, yes, they come together, they try to do their work, but it's still in a phase that they really still have to find their position. And lots of tenseful meetings have already been organized, and then there is still, let's say, mutual recriminations, like it, especially in the past weekend. If you have looked a little bit at the discussions between, on the one hand, Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and European Council President Charles Michel with Prime Minister Boris Johnson, but especially also the bilateral talk between French President Emmanuel Macron and Prime Minister Boris Johnson. I mean, this was not a nice, let's say, side aspect of the G7 meeting. It showed essentially the West divided, and it was the Director General of the World Trade Organization that openly cautioned for a trade war between the UK and the European Union. And indeed, a trade war between the UK and the EU, I hope it can all be avoided, but it could happen, and it would really weaken the West, and it would not be in anybody's interest, except maybe of some foreign powers that like to see us divided, but that's not in our own interest. But so, I mean, yes, many things will still require further negotiation. Also, under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, let's also keep in mind that there are certain mechanisms in that Trade and Cooperation Agreement where indeed there are mutual commitments on not lowering the standards with regard to the environment, workers' rights, climate change. And so indeed, as you can imagine, the EU has been very, very, let's say, careful about negotiating those, provisions and safeguards in order to make sure that indeed you would not have what we call a race to the bottom in the United Kingdom. How this will be interpreted and applied, we will have to see. It may well be that in the future there could be certain disputes with regard to those questions, like there may be also other issues in the area of competition law, state aid regulations, and so on and so forth. So lots of things still need to be, agreed upon, need to be followed up, need to be further implemented, operationalized, and so on. And I just hope that the relationship will, at a certain moment, stabilize. Because what we now really see on both sides, I'm afraid, is some kind of, flexing of the muscles, everybody showing that they think they are on the right side of history, unilateral declarations, unilateral interpretations. Of course, we have different domestic constituencies for which we speak, But in the end, what matters is that we can develop a mature post, say, Brexit relationship with each other. And it's absolutely needed, as is shown also by the G7 meeting last weekend. We need the West to be united in tackling a number of very, very important global challenges. And we can simply not afford too many disputes and disagreements between the UK and the European Union.
Thank you very much, Professor Dhingra. The floor is yours.
So mine follows actually very directly from what Professor Wouters just said, which is to say that I think I'm going to give you sort of a little bit more in terms of what should that agreement look like and where could we still go. So I completely agree that there seems to be still, years of negotiation and renegotiation and figuring out whether compliance is happening or not. So one way that the agreement could still be structured to fill in those gaps that exist is by, taking a much more pragmatic, cold-headed view rather than an emotional view, which is really what's guided a lot of the sort of arm twisting and flexing of muscles, which is to say that, well, we started with a point of perfect alignment. We disagree with the European Union on certain aspects, and we want to be, we don't want to comply with their view of the world, and that's perfectly fine. Every sovereign nation has the opportunity to do that. And if the UK is taking back control in that sense, then it should basically have points of divergence, which it agrees on beforehand, and then negotiate accordingly. That these are points of divergence we want to have. For everything else, we're actually fine with you, and we want that market access so that, both sides prosper. And I think taking a much, much more sort of really, really clinical view like that would be much more productive for both sides. And exactly as Professor Wouters said, the point is to stay united, especially at this point in time in the world when we're seeing the biggest economic, disaster in history, one of the biggest. And sort of coming out of that, you need a lot more cooperation, and you need a lot more sort of ensuring that the race to the bottom doesn't happen. And that's really where we should be headed.
Okay, thank you very much. I think you deserve an applause. And it has been great, all the insights you have brought to this webinar. So I just want to thank you really for your participation. We were honored by your presence, and let's hope we have another chance to keep on discussing these very interesting issues.
Thank you very much. It was an honor and a pleasure for us as well. Thank you.
Exactly. Thank you.